And we're going to delve into the rise in anti-Semitism happening today, the effect it has on your Jewish neighbors, and how we as a community can resist its onslaught. So tonight is going to be a little different. I think there's going to be a short presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to be popping in and out because we're going to have food afterwards. There is regular coffee. Feel free to just nibble as you go, but pay attention to the presentation. I'm going to bring out...
Nibble and listen.
Yeah. So just don't pay attention to me running in and out because I'm just getting things ready for afterwards. So I'm going to make this introduction super brief. This is Rabi Gavi Ruit. She is the Director of Lifelong Learning at the Farmington Valley Jewish Congregation, Emek Shalom. Welcome to the Rabbi, and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you. Well, it's lovely to be here for our third and final part of this series. Just as a little recap, if you weren't here for all three, the first part of this series was basically highlights of Jewish history. Our second section was the evolution of Jewish theology, and then we're ending today with a less lovely topic, anti-Semitism today. But in many ways, I structured the class in that way to give the framework necessary to understand where we are today. And I think we can't divorce anti-Semitism today from its historical origins, which is why it's really important to understand context. So right now I'm going to give a little overview of anti-Semitism, starting with the Middle Ages. And I'll be very honest about this. My area of specialty is medieval and modern Jewish theology, so I almost always start with the Middle Ages. That's kind of my go-to. It also happens to be the time in which so much of Jewish practice came into being. It's also the period in which the greatest tensions and struggles between Jews as a minority culture and their surrounding cultures, be it Christian or Muslim, worked themselves out for better or worse. And quite often it was worse. So I am all for questions, and allergies are just killing me these days, so I'm going to have lots of water close by. If you have questions as we go along before we get to the discussion part, just pop them out. I have no problem with that.
Just a quick question on the discussion part.
Thank you for providing an example.
I know that this first part of the presentation is going to get recorded. Is the discussion also recorded? And where does the recording go?
Those are great questions to which I have no answer. But that gentleman there, Mark.
Repeat the question, please.
The question is, we know that the first part of my sort of lecture part is being recorded. The question is whether the discussion is being recorded as well, and if so, where is it accessible?
The intent is to record the discussion.
Okay.
And it can be played on SCM's TV channels. It can also be played on YouTube. That's up to you.
So given that for the first time the answer is that it can be played on the something channel. What channel is that again? Can you repeat?
Channel 95.
Channel 95.
SCM EDU channel.
Yes, so channel 95, we'll just go with that. It can be played there or on YouTube. But you do raise an important question. Up until this point, these classes have been mostly me talking, and this class is going to be more of a discussion in which you folks may or may not want to have your thoughts on this topic recorded. So I'm curious, is there anyone who would object to having this session posted, specifically the discussion portion of it, posted on those two two ways in which it's accessible. Any objections to having your voices be a part of? Okay. Give it some thought. If it turns out that there is, if we get to a point where you go, oh, well, I'm not sure I want that out there, let me know before we post. Okay. So, any other points of order, questions? All right. So, anti-Semitism today. As I said, I always begin with the Middle Ages for reasons beyond it being my area. It's also, there's so much there. But the sentiments that we experience during the Middle Ages cannot be called anti-Semitism. And hopefully by the time I'm through the Middle Ages section, the reason for that will be quite clear. But during the Middle Ages, what we experienced was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, a lot of anti-Jewish actions that usually came under three categories: exclusion, oppression, or expulsion. So, during the Middle Ages, Jews were prohibited from doing a lot of things, from marrying Christians. This was largely a response to Constantine. When Constantine, around 340, somewhere in there, mid-330s, Constantine declared the state of Rome to be a Christian nation. And that action, that bringing a political bringing Judaism to a political place, I did not articulate that well at all. By making religion political, Constantine created the situation in which anti-Jewish sentiment was going to be a given. Jews went from being just one of many cultures that had their own gods. It was a time of, I want to use the word idolatry, that's not the word I'm looking for. It was a time when many different religions prevailed. Jews had their God. But once Rome became a Christian nation, all other religions became immediately in tension with the Christian nation. Now, it becomes even more problematic for Jews because of the issue of supersessionism. So, what the Christian theology was at this time was that Christians were actually the true Israelites. They had replaced or superseded the Jews. The Jews were, according to Christian theology of this time, no longer necessary and simply obstinate in their unwillingness to accept the true divinity that they saw as in the form of Jesus. This would not have been an issue because at this time, when there were multiple, when it was a very polytheistic period, I came around and found the word I was looking for. It was a very polytheistic time, and that was generally accepted. Everybody generally got to practice their own religion in a modicum of peace until this moment, when Constantine makes Rome a Christian nation, and therefore every other religion was on the defensive, especially Judaism, because Judaism had the added onus of being very inconvenient to Christian theology. And that plays itself out. So Jews were prohibited from marrying Christians, they were prohibited from holding positions in government, and they were prohibited from appearing as witnesses against Christians. So I call this the anti-Judaism of exclusion. It's everywhere that Jews were not allowed in. And compared to the other forms of anti-Judaism, this is relatively benign, because we get to the anti-Judaism of oppression, in which, aside, other than being excluded, Jews are specifically targets. And Jews were, what we would call a pogrom. Everybody know what a pogrom is? Okay, so it's a rampaging, sort of terrorist, state-sanctioned, often terrorist, directed at a specific group, often. So the first pogroms began with the Crusaders, as the Crusaders were on their way to the Holy Land to retrieve the Holy Land from the heathen, so the Christians said, the heathen Muslims. They plundered, murdered, and terrorized many Jews along the way. So part of this religious fervor of reclaiming the Holy Land for Christianity was an incredibly bloody venture in which Jews were often the targets. Jews were also blamed for the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague was killing everybody, but in times of fear, people looked for scapegoats. Jews were an easy scapegoat, and the response was often to be burned at the stake. So that was often the case. We also had blood libel accusations during the Middle Ages. Now, blood libel is this very bizarre conspiracy theory that believes or suggests that Jews, for their matzah on Pesach, Passover, required the blood of young Christian boys. This whole mythology developed because a young Christian boy was found dead. Nobody could figure out why, the cause. And so this mythology was developed that he was actually executed as a means of providing blood for the matzah. Now, just if you're unfamiliar with Judaism, blood's a big deal in Judaism. So in fact, it's such a big deal that in kosher meat is drained of all blood because Jews do not want to be consuming this substance. So the idea that Jews would, the idea that anybody would engage in that type of behavior is absurd, but it's all the more so given Jewish culture. But it happened quite a bit, and a lot of Jews died as a result. And then we have leaders such as Martin Luther, who called for the slaying of all Jews because of their lies. Now, something to know about Martin Luther is he started out kind of okay with the Jewish people. He was kind of like, the only reason that they haven't come over to the right side is because we Christians haven't been kind enough. So for a decade or two, he advocated kind treatment of the Jews. But after a period of time, he got very, very frustrated with Jews' unwillingness to flock to churches, and his rhetoric changed and became very, very aggressive, calling for the death of Jews. So we've got anti-Judaism of oppression. We also have the anti-Judaism of expulsion. So Jews were expelled from a number of places. England in the 1200s, France in almost the 14, and Spain in 1492. So the thing about the expulsions, especially the Spanish expulsion, is they were demoralizing and incredibly painful for the Jews involved. For the Jews of Spain, they were just coming off of what we now refer to as the Spanish Golden Age. There was so much fecundity and writings and evolution in science and literature and poetry that happened in the 500 years preceding the expulsion that Jews saw Spain as their homeland. And so when this expulsion occurred, it affected Jews across the world, because that sense of insecurity, to be expelled from a place that you had been such an integral part of for so long, was gobsmacking for everybody involved. The absolute sort of degradation of a people. The only thing that you could compare the Spanish expulsion to in modernity, in terms of its impact, is the Shoah or Holocaust. That sense of being attacked as a people. And this just, for those of you who were here, or for those who were not here last time, this Spanish expulsion and the really sort of impactful, psychologically impactful effect it had, led to the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah, which is in fact a very empowered, in many ways empowered theology. One of the things I love about Kabbalah, which is another area that I often teach, is it comes from people who are so degraded and so laid low. And in response to that utter degradation, they develop a theology that says, wait a second, God needs us as much as we need God. God needs us in partnership with divinity to make the world whole. So just a little side about, yes?
When they were expelled, where did they go?
Great question. The question is, when they were expelled, where did they go? Many of them went to Eretz Israel, so the land of Israel. That's how we get this big Kabbalistic movement that leads to the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah, is a lot of the really learned scholars in Spain end up in Sfat, in the city of Sfat in Israel. That is where most of them went, but others scattered to other, some went to Egypt for a while, and then that became less hospitable. But many went to Portugal. But then we had the Portuguese expulsion not too much longer later. So.
My grandfather says we came from Spain initially, and then we went to Russia. So that's why we're Russian.
Ah, okay.
Well, yeah, that was because the Polish princes recognized the merits of getting people into their unoccupied lands, and they actually took.
Yeah, that's a little bit later than the expulsion that happens in the 1600s, most dramatically. So I'm not questioning that did occur, but that big pull from Poland happens a little bit later. Any other questions?
Yeah, just one other thing as well. As you presented, there was still, even within Christianity, there was a tension because the popes in series for hundreds of years issued what they call papal bull that said, protect the Jews are our friends.
Until they didn't.
And the local churches and Franciscans, Dominicans who were on a slightly different direction.
So you're absolutely right. There were popes who were quite protective of Jewish people during this period, and there were popes who were not. And it really the level of Jewish security depended on who was in power at the time. Okay, so the thing about these types of anti-Jewish sentiment is, in their own way, they were escapable. Jews didn't have to remain as such. They could convert. And I'm not saying that's a desirable option. As a rabbi, I don't see it as such. But it was a way out. So for many Jews who converted, they went on to live, integrated lives within their communities. After the Spanish expulsion, it's a little more trepidatious because they started questioning the sincerity of the conversions. But if a Jew felt a pull to Christianity, they would necessarily, through the act of conversion, leave this oppression and expulsion and exclusion behind. So that changes dramatically with the Enlightenment. And it's during the Enlightenment that anti-Judaism, I should have put anti-Judaism, not anti-Jewish. So at the time of the Enlightenment, what happens is this anti-Judaism sentiment turns, that can be escaped if you change religions, becomes a physiological identification as a race. Jews go from being a religion within the eyes of those who are not Jewish to a race. And the reasons for that are the Enlightenment brought a shift in what the source of truth was considered. So all through the Middle Ages, the keeper of truth was religion, right? That you went to your priests or your rabbis or your ministers. Actually, ministers would be quite a bit later. But you go to your your holders of religious power for the answers of truth. But with the Enlightenment, this psychological mindset shifted to a much more scientific orientation. There was this incredible sense of possibility that science could solve anything. And you see during this time period all sorts of fields of study develop and become much more exacting and much more focused. And with this rise of dependence on science for truth, you also had the evolution of a lot of pseudosciences. Because with this development of biblical historical examination and the different types of scientific approaches to a lot of different fields, you also had things like eugenics and I forget the name. Phrenology. Thank you.
Don't ask me why.
I'm just glad you do. The response to these pseudosciences was the same it was to more legitimate sciences. Oh, this is an area where we can discern truth. This is a method through which we can garner truth. And through pseudoscience, Jews came to be seen as a race instead of a religion, and necessarily an inferior race, a race that was, and you can list all of the anti-Judaism things that you saw in the Middle Ages, dirty, grotesque. These are, I started by putting some imagery. I was going to bring in, I like to bring in imagery, and I just couldn't stomach it today. So I left the images of Jews with grotesquely elongated noses and horns and, sucking from pigs, suckling from pigs. These were all images you saw all throughout the Middle Ages. But now they're given a cleaner sort of presentation. This is science now. This isn't just folklore. This is science. And this establishment of Jews as a race, and specifically as an inferior race, where all of the anti-Jewish sentiment from the Middle Ages gets put into a nice, clean little scientific package, it is difficult to not see a direct line between the evolution of this approach to Jewish peoplehood and what we see in the Holocaust. Because this dehumanization that we see the same dehumanization in the Middle Ages, but in the Middle Ages, it was a choice from the Christian point of view. It was a choice, and you could make a different choice. You could become not the dirty, wily, money-obsessed person that Jews were identified as. But with the rise of the Enlightenment, it now becomes an inherent, an essential quality of the Jewish people. It ceases to be about Judaism and becomes about the Jewish people, which means you can't escape it. And certainly Hitler saw no need for you. All you needed was one grandparent, and you could have spent your entire life as a Catholic, but you had one grandparent who was Jewish, and according to the Nuremberg laws, you were necessarily of that inferior race. Yes? Okay. So I think that's a wonderful question. And it's a question that only an oppressor can ask, because the oppressed is just trying to survive. So the exclusion was probably Jews withdrew in many respects, not during the Enlightenment, but in the Middle Ages, as a means of survival and self-integration. But so I have to come back to Constantine and supersessionism, in that as soon as the orientation of Christianity was that Jews and Judaism was no longer necessary because Christianity had replaced them, there was not an ability to commingle easily. That sense of separation that you're talking about certainly did exist across history, but it exists largely because Judaism was under threat. And in the Enlightenment, you see a huge attempt by Jews to integrate as best as possible. Moses Mendelssohn is a really good example. He was an amazing self-taught scholar. And he did, in all ways, try to engage with his Christian counterparts, including in areas of philosophy. But he was always seen as the interloper in many respects. So I guess I saw on your face your response to my initial response. What I'm trying to say is, when you are identified as, when you are a minority who is identified as other and inferior, there may very well be a reaction to withdraw. But that starting point with Constantine is really where that cycle started. Okay, any other questions? All right. Okay, so anti-Semitism today. You know, it is not good out there right now. In my entire lifetime, I have never felt frightened to identify as a Jew. But there are situations where I do today. The Tree of Life massacre, does anyone not know what that is? Regarding synagogue where several people were murdered in Pittsburgh. I have a very dear friend who actually attends that synagogue, and it's every anniversary of that event is traumatic for the entire area. We have We have kids in Simsbury, in my school, who I run a religious school, who talk about seeing swastikas carved into the desks at school. So there's a...
Public school?
So my clergy partner and I went and spoke with the Simsbury Middle School principal, and he said every year when they are reading Anne Frank, because they do every year, they get Nazi salutes and swastikas. And you know, his response is excellent. There's an immediate response. It's well thought out, but it's still something that is grappled with every year when this is being taught. So, okay. So what is anti-Semitism? There are lots of different definitions. This one is from the ADL, in which they say anti-Semitism is the marginalization and or oppression of people who are Jewish based on the belief in stereotypes and myths about Jewish people, Judaism, and Israel. Personally, I don't think it's a great definition. I don't think any of the definitions of anti-Semitism truly capture, and they're usually developed by committee, which I have nothing else to say on that. But I think this gives that is broad enough to give a sense if we're dealing with marginalization and or oppression based on stereotypes and myths. Some of the stereotypes that we are seeing resurface again are ones that are from the Middle Ages or from the early Enlightenment. There are new iterations of the Elders of Zion, which was, anybody familiar with the Elders of Zion? Okay. Elders of Zion was a fabricated manuscript that outlined the Jewish intent to control the world. It was fabricated by the Russian secret police. It was a propaganda mechanism that was picked up by Henry Ford, who republished it here, and it's making the rounds again. This conspiracy theory has been debunked and researched thoroughly and is debunked every time it comes to the surface, but it continues to come to the surface. This idea that Jews are intent on controlling the world. And many folks take it in and believe it, and if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. Thank you. That was tongue in cheek. But this is the definition we're dealing with. So ADL goes on to say anti-Semitism can manifest in a myriad of ways, including stereotypes and attitudes about Jews, scapegoating. Scapegoating is a big one. Name-calling and bullying, online expressions of bias and hate, swastikas, and other hate symbols. And there's been a huge preponderance of swastikas lately. I gave a talk at Simsbury United Methodist back in January, and a recent article had talked about how the only Jewish family on a street in Massachusetts had swastikas pinned on every step in purple construction, cut out in purple construction paper, and leading to the doorway. So this family, the only Jewish family on the street, how are you going to feel like that level of targeted? It is happening much more frequently today than it has at any point in my lifetime. Yes. Well, there was a white supremacist who was really targeting a Jewish family, if I'm remembering and if I remember properly, the town actually responded in a positive way, in a supportive way, but I don't remember the details thoroughly, if you want to share. Yeah. So what that does is every family in that area feels insecure, unsafe, under siege. The level of, and this might be a tad hyperbolic, but only a tad, the level of psychological torture for the greater Jewish community when one family is targeted. I mean, obviously it is worse for that one family, but there is not a family that doesn't feel that same sense of insecurity. In fact, I'll give you an example at my shul, my synagogue. I'm not a big fan of having security guards, generally. I understand that when we have services, we have to have them. We had not had, I run the religious school, we had not had a security guard at the religious school. I'm usually quite opposed to having such security at religious school because my previous incarnation was as a developmental specialist, and the psychological consequences to children who recognize they can't even come to synagogue without needing to be protected is so deleterious. Normally I'm really, like, if you're doing a risk-benefit analysis, I usually side on, yeah, we're a small little shul, we're not in the middle of any big city, let's not. But the level of terror and angst on the part of my parents about bringing their kids to religious school, it became untenable. And I finally went, yeah, let's do it. Because at that point, the cost-benefit analysis had shifted. But these parents were feeling this way because they were listening to and reading about all of these other incidences that are near and far. And having access to knowing that this is happening in a town in Montana or in a town in Massachusetts, like as different as two states could be, right? That we're having, there was a big risk assessment in New Jersey not long ago, and it so rattled the greater community that a lot of synagogues here upped their security in response. So it's the terror factor, right? It is pretty extreme. So we've got swastikas and other hate symbols scrawled in public places, anti-Semitic rhetoric, vandalism in synagogues and Jewish cemeteries. This is very much on the rise, or hate crimes. So prevalence. And I have to be honest with you, I kept these notes to a minimum, mostly because I think that we will get more out of discussion about potential solutions than harping too much on the state of affairs. But in 2022, the Anti-Defamation League recorded almost 4,000 anti-Semitic incidents throughout the US. It was a 36% increase over 2021 and the highest ever recorded. But it was the third time in 5 years that the year-end total was the highest number ever recorded. So we're going like this. And it's scary to a lot of us. Okay, so that's basically my overview. What I'd like us to do is concentrate on some questions and discussion at this point. But before we hop into the questions, any questions that y'all have? Yes, Lynn. Correct.
And so at what point or how did anti-Semitism become?
That's a great idea. Please. Thank you.
Thank you. How did anti-Semitism become particular to the Jewish people? That's because I've never used this before.
going to need your help on this one.
Hello, hello.
There you go, you got it.
So when did anti-Semitism, or why did it arise to, particular to the Jewish people instead of all of the Semitic people? Is it because they're the largest percentage of Semitic people?
They're not. We are not. The
Right,
largest
I
percentages.
don't know, so I was
It's a great
wondering about
question.
that.
I can take that back since you look so very uncomfortable holding it. Thank you. So the actual term anti-Semitism was developed by a very biased historian. I have blocked out his name, I am sorry. But it was around, it was the, sort of mid-Enlightenment period. And he wrote an article about why Jews shouldn't be anymore. That there was that they really had been replaced by Christianity, and so they were obsolete as a people. They did nothing to uplift society. Forget all the Nobel Prizes. There was nothing to uplift. They only degraded the greater community, and therefore we ought to be anti-Semitic. So that term anti-Semitism was developed originally as a sort of a promotion technique. This is how we ought to be viewing the Jews. Now, the reason it was targeted towards Jews and not greater Semitic people is because in the mid-Enlightenment period, there weren't a lot of Muslims readily available to disparage, but there were in Europe many Jews. And so for this historian, it was the Jewish people was the Semitic people that needed to be eradicated. That's how that came. Any other questions before we go discussion? All right. So the first question, kind of a random question, is how many folks are familiar with events like Tree of Life or Colleyville, Texas? And Colleyville, Texas might not ring as many bells. Okay, so person went in to a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, and held at gunpoint 4 people hostage for several hours. The rabbi there tried to engage in a conversation with the individual. He was eventually killed in a gunfight. He was the only one that was killed in that event. And his beef was that Jews were very problematic for a whole list and litany of reasons that were very consistent with the conspiracy theory kind of rhetoric that we've heard across history. And somehow the rabbi kept him talking enough that, and enough time went on that there was a shift and folks were able to get away. Tree of Life was the event that happened in Pittsburgh. So what do you feel when you hear about such events?
Is it white supremacists that are at the bottom of this, or is it, what effect is the white supremacist movement on this?
Well,
related to this?
It's quite related. So the question is, what effect is the white supremacist movement has on this? Who remembers what went down in Charlottesville? Right, so we had, I believe it was Proud Boys, or it was Proud Boys, dressed in those funny Hawaiian shirts, carrying tiki torches, and saying, Jews will not replace us. That is white supremacist rhetoric, and it drives much of this behavior. That idea that Jews are going to replace us, or replace, not me, clearly, but replace anything, and necessarily need to be squashed and minimized and in some cases snuffed out because there is potential to be supplanted. The white supremacist ideology is that any non-white, non-cisgender, often non-male folks are trying to take away the power that they should rightly have. That's the sort of the undercurrent of the ideology. And the canary in the coal mine on a lot of these things is anti-Semitism. So we are seeing an uptick in anti-Semitism. We're also seeing an uptick in anti-Muslim rhetoric, anti-brown people, anti-black people rhetoric. Much of it comes from the white supremacist rhetoric.
I think it's more specific than that, because the reference to the Jews not replacing us is part of a specific idea called the Great Replacement Theory, which is that there is a plot to replace white Christians in America with people of color. And as part of that ideology, it's believed that the people of color aren't bright enough to affect this, and therefore some supremely intelligent group, the Jews,
the
are
wily
manipulating it. And that's specifically part of what motivated the Tree of Life attack. And that's why it's important to recognize that the statistics you gave about anti-Jewish attacks could also be given for attacks on Muslims,
100%.
attacks on immigrants, attacks on African Americans, and that these are not separate movements or separate phenomena.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think that is an important piece, that our discussion here is on anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is often the canary in the coal mine. But the pervasiveness of dehumanizing hate is on the rise in this country across the board. And people of all types are suffering. And queer people are suffering as a result. We've got immigrants and Jews and Muslims and any people of color and anyone who is perceived to not fit in to this white cisgender power structure is getting a lot of crap these days. And it has a really just degrading effect on our society. I'll share my cards. I think that you're absolutely right. It is all interconnected. I also think things like the congressman's aides who were beaten with a baseball bat yesterday are part of this same overarching hate problem that we have in this country. It is at its most dangerous within, I believe, it's within its most dangerous within the replacement theory ideology, because there's action that's happening.
I don't think we have, people don't have respect for other people either in this day and age. I mean, who would ever go in? I mean, have you ever heard of people going into a political office and beating other people? It's the things that are happening are so crazy. Judges are afraid. I mean, it's not.
Nancy Pelosi's husband.
Yeah, I mean, it's just crazy what's happening in this world. And I think it's, yes, anti-Semitism has increased, but the sign of the times right now is we're in bad shape in the United States.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, probably because I listen to too much talk radio, but what is happening in our country right now in terms of the escalation of hate, the escalation of, if you bother me, I can respond by shooting you. Or if I ring your doorbell and you weren't expecting me to, I shoot you, is bizarre behavior. I don't know about y'all, but it's new to me. It is also very much connected to illiberalism generally and the diminishment of democracy generally. I worry for my congregants, I worry for my kids in my school, I worry for my Jewish folk, because as a rabbi, that's part of my job. But I also worry about our country, because this escalation of hate across the board, this idea that any group would replace you, is anti-democratic and has the potential to do much really long-term insult or an injury to our society generally. Again, I'm veering off of my expertise area a little bit, but this is how I see it.
Two things. One, your first question. You said, how do you feel? I didn't hear anybody answer how they felt. They went right to a cause, but there was... All right. I did, in response to the first question, how do you feel? I didn't hear anybody answer how they felt. And for me, Uvalde set me off to the point was I was in the middle of services and I just froze. I just stood there and they went on and that's a different story. But the other thing is the lack of effective moral education. I'm not quite sure how to phrase it. But who is the other side of this hate? Who is instructing all these people? If they claim they are good, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Where is the proper moral education about what's right and what's wrong?
Right. So that's difficult, right? Moral questions are ones that we tend to want to keep out of public school systems largely. I think that we have suffered greatly by obliterating citizenship training in our schools, right? When I went to school many moons ago in Newport Beach, California, we learned how our democratic system worked, civics. We learned how we could participate. We learned not only what our rights were, but what our responsibilities were. That type of education has largely gone away. In fact, in Rhode Island, where I had lived prior to coming to Connecticut, there was a student actually sued for lack of civics training because they got into the world and were completely unprepared on how to be a citizen in society. And I think that is maybe an offshoot of the problem. There are many. Go ahead.
I say anything goes, and I say it not for me, because we're old, but in terms of our grandchildren when they grow up with this. I'm going to say with this country, but what this world is.
Yeah, this is a worldwide phenomenon going on right now.
What kind of a life are our grandchildren going to have?
Yeah. I ask myself that all the time. It's
What are the kids in your school? Do they say anything to you?
yeah. Well, I think the little ones are not really aware. So the school ends at 7th grade. I'm sorry? Farmington Valley. Yeah. There is. I listen in all the. I'm walking around. I'm listening to them talk. And they'll talk about something that frightens them, some incident that has occurred, and that frightens them. And then there's very much a wanting to get as far away from the topic as possible. And I think that's developmentally appropriate for kids that can't hold that. I mean, it's hard enough for me at my age with my training to hold in my head what's going on in the world right now. For a very much not fully developed brain, it's going to be overwhelming a lot of the time. So I'll get puffs of this is very distressing, and then an immediate desire to change the subject and to go into easier waters.
I don't think except for this gentleman, I don't think anybody has said anything about how we've felt about this.
He's right, yes.
There's so much of this. Like, I worry that I just don't feel anything about it. You know? Thank you. Thanks. I thought I was loud enough, but maybe not. You know, there's just so much of this that it's hard to really feel appropriately. Like, I feel like all of these things should just be devastating, but I've kind of maxed out on devastation for a while. You know, it's just, you know, and I think that that's also, you know, kind of psychologically sort of where you get to when you get hit with so many of these things.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. What I would suggest, or at least the methodology I use to keep my sanity and to keep engaged, is I go on periodic breaks. I'm a news hound. That's probably one of my least positive qualities because there's so much distressing news. And I periodically, when I am not moved by something that I see that I would normally be moved by, and I go, okay, I need a little recalibration. And I will take a few days off of news. Sometimes there was a period after Tree of Life where I took a couple of weeks off of interacting so that I could refortify myself for the fight. Because in here I'm going to be all rabbi on you. It is a fight. It is a moral fight. Again, I believe in my kishkas, solar plexus, for those of you who aren't familiar, I believe in my kishkas that the only way to make a better world is to constantly fight evil that is never ending. We will never succeed. All we can do, we will never master evil, but we can keep some of the destruction at bay. It requires a willingness to fight, to be in the game. And sometimes you can't be. Sometimes you need to check out a little bit. And so that's okay. You will get back there. You got to give yourself that space.
I'm on a news fast for like a year.
What was that?
I said I've been on this news fast for about a year.
Like you said, you want to say, how did you feel? Everything is happening there. I listen to the news every day, and I read the paper every day, and you see what's coming locally, or I'm glad it's not here yet. Or you read about here, oh, that's close.
Yeah.
But
New York's just, yeah. It's tough. Okay, anybody want to share how they feel before we move on? Go ahead, Lynn.
Every time I hear or read about an incident, I feel it personally, and I can't continue reading about it. I can't because it hurts too much. And I saw it. I raised my kids in a small rural community, and I thought that anti-Semitism there was really, and there were incidents. Like we were the only Jewish people in the town, and possibly in the county, and which in my naivety didn't realize that actually places like that existed. You know.
It's Jews everywhere.
No, right.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that, you know, people just didn't know anybody because they didn't know any Jews. They didn't know anything about Jews or Judaism or anything like that. But now, at least here, that's certainly not the reason.
Yeah, certainly if we're looking at, perhaps if we're looking at more the anti-Semitic microaggressions, you know, using phraseology like, oh, wow, he really Jewed me down, right? Folks say, I've heard that here in this town. I am quite certain that not everybody recognizes the long history of that trope of accusing Jews of being incredibly money-focused and money-hungry. For many, it's just what you say. It's what they heard growing up. So in some cases, I think there is ignorance at the source. But things like the white supremacist orientation, that's not ignorance. That is a pervasive hate, which is a choice, I think, as well. Okay, so we're not gonna, I have another page of questions, which clearly we're not gonna get through all of them, but we'll, so here's an easy one. Has anybody here heard or seen anti-Semitic instances in your school, community, or online? I almost think that this part isn't a fair part of the question because it's pervasive online. Yes. Okay. Can you give us an example?
Yes. There are a couple. When my older daughter was or my younger daughter was in, when my younger daughter was in 5th grade, on the playground, there was a boy who called her a dirty Jew. And she looked at him and called him a stupid redneck. And so when she came home and told me that, I asked if she'd gone to the teacher who was, you know, at recess duty, and she said no, and I said, well, you need to tell her. So she did the next day, and I got a call immediately from the principal asking me how I would like him to handle it. I mean, he was going to call them all in, but was there anything specific that I wanted to say or to do, which I really appreciated. And then when my older daughter was in 7th or 8th grade, there were kids that were drawing swastikas and calling her names and stuff like that, and it was hard because there were no other Jews, and so we had to have the discussion just at home, like why, mommy, why, you know, and so.
Very hard. Those discussions are very hard because there's no rational explanation, right? There's not. It really comes down to ignorance and hate. And those are very difficult things to explain to a little one. Thank you, Lynn. So we've touched on a few things, but any thoughts on why such incidents are increasing, and they are at a very significant rate? Yes?
Being provoked politically.
Oh, interesting. Okay, you want to say more about that?
No. I don't think I need to elaborate.
Okay. But that does touch on something very important, which is leadership. Yes. One of the reasons I think we're in this kind of mess right now is our political leaders don't tend to be leaders these days. The last real leader I can think of, and I didn't vote for him, but in this case he was exquisite, was John McCain. When John McCain, during an event, like a town hall, a woman went off about how he was just a Muslim and not really a Christian and not really an American, and John McCain said, stop, that's not correct. Mr. Obama and I disagree about things in politics, but we both love this country. And he put an end to it. We don't have leadership right now that has the moxie to do such things. And that's, that's on us as a society, because we're the ones who vote our leaders in. And we have the ability to make change. It's often we see in elections a real sort of lackadaisical attitude, disinterested. We have very poor, except for the last presidential election, we generally have really poor turnout. And hopefully that will change, because one of the things that we do have power to do is change our leaders. And, if they are not leading appropriately. Would you like to?
Who's coming up?
Well, yes, we have to, but there are a lot of really good people that have, there's a whole sort of, industry is not the right word, but a whole, but there's a whole industry of getting, young, interested people in the political process. I think that's very important. Any other thoughts on why such things are increasing?
I agree with this gentleman that it's a political issue, but when I was growing up, I could see a clear difference between the politics in this country and the politics in Europe in the 1930s, when powerful political leaders expressly propagated lies about vulnerable groups. And in this country, that started to change after 9/11, and it didn't have to do with the Jews, it had to do with Muslims. And we got members of Congress and presidential candidates who told the same kinds of stories about Muslim immigrants that were told about Jews in the 1930s, that they spread diseases, that they were terrorists, that they wanted to take over our country. And that continued unabated, and not to get all Reverend Bonhoeffer about it, now it has spread. So now, within the last week, Michael Flynn, a convicted felon, who has been holding rallies across the country with people who expressly espouse support for Hitler, who has said we should have one religion in this country. And yesterday, the former president called him up to say, if I'm reelected, you're going to serve in my administration. We have Republican leaders throughout Congress decrying prosecutors as George Soros-backed prosecutors in the same sense. I mean, it's an anti-Semitic dog whistle. And this is true not only of white Christians, because there are members of the current government in Israel. There's one in particular who had a poster of Baruch Goldstein on his wall for many years. For those who didn't know, Baruch Goldstein is the man who murdered 29 Palestinians in Hebron in the 1990s. And this man is now in charge of essentially a new Israeli National Guard and put in charge of Palestinians. The whole movement, or the whole trope of attacking George Soros, is something that was invented in Hungary as a political move on behalf of President Orban by two American pollsters who said this will be a good target for you. Spread some anti-Semitism in Hungary. Now the entire Republican Party has adopted it. So what's at issue here is a political leadership that is willing to engage in the kind of rhetoric that used to be absent from American politics. And that, I think, is more important than any other factor in what you've been discussing tonight.
I don't disagree. So I used to teach Holocaust history at University of Southern California, and had a lot of business majors A lot of folks not terribly interested. They were taking my class because it was an elective that they had to take to get their degree. And my last semester teaching there was during the 2016 Republican primaries. And so I, discussing the arc of evolution within Germany in the 30s, and I was drawing parallels to what the kind of rhetoric, the kind of dog whistles, the kind of use of language that we were seeing during that primary was very consistent with the kind of rhetoric that you saw in 33 in Berlin. And most of my students were like, Rabi Ruit, you're nuts. This is just silly. He's really rich, therefore he must be very smart. And I had very little to say in response to that. But in the years since, I have had multiple students from that class reach out to me and say, I'm a queer Latina. I'm afraid. Do I need to go stay with family in Mexico? I am of color and terror-filled being on this campus, because the politics of the campus were leading in a direction that made this individual feel afraid. But the amount of fear that I have gotten from these students who were not white cisgendered male, largely. I mean, that were the ones who were in fear, is palpable, and it breaks my heart on many levels. But the rhetoric's it's very similar. Even the tropes are very similar to what was used in the 30s. So you can't get away from those parallels. And unfortunately, this has become a worldwide phenomenon. We're seeing spikes in anti-Semitism in Europe. Hungary and Poland are really tough places, and it has the same kind of qualitative feel to it that hellacious time in history had, which, y'all don't know me, but I am not an alarmist. I'm usually the one saying, hey, y'all, we'll just ride this out. And in fact, what I said to several of my students was, we've survived bad presidents before, I don't feel that way anymore. I feel that we, over the last several years, we have, as a society, are in a really precarious place. And that precarious place is fueled by hate, but it's having impact on our very democratic structure, which should alarm us, I think. Okay, how are we doing on? All right. Okay, these were the softball questions. So let's. So I just want us to have a discussion of this last question. What do you think we should do about anti-Semitism and other forms of bias and hate? Okay, any?
Get Fox off the news.
So propaganda and misinformation are integral parts of anti-democratic impulses. It's certainly the first time in my lifetime where, depending on your orientation or who you are as a person or your politics, you can consume news that, when I was growing up, were all three stations, because there were only three, might have a slightly different spin, but they were giving the same facts. You would get the same input on any one of those channels. Today, you've got demonstrably It's like there are two different news worlds going on. I think that is really problematic. Anything else?
Well, it's not just Fox News. It's also the fact that we have like local news stations that are being bought up by larger corporations that have a very far right wing perspective, and so you don't even get like local news in your state that is like unbiased.
Again, misinformation, unbiased information, it's really important. Any other thoughts?
Change is going to happen one person at a time. As my relationship with people I meet, to build them up and encourage and accept and try to understand.
I love that. And I think that's absolutely a very important piece of this puzzle. And one of the things that we're doing at my synagogue, in partnership with Simsbury United Methodist, is creating opportunities to form bonds between our communities. We had a lovely event last night. I thought it was lovely.
So I think we haven't even talked about climate, which I think is just going to make all these other things just so much worse.
Sure.
What do you mean by climate?
Climate, environment, the physical planet that's...
As resources get more scarce, the tendency to scapegoat increases.
And we're also going to have, I think, a lot of climate refugees as some parts of the planet become much more difficult to live in. But setting all of that aside, I would just like to invite everybody here to a potluck that we're having at the church a week from Thursday. The scale of the problems in the world are just so immense that I think the only way that you can handle it is to help one thing at a time. So what our church has done, and we're going to start another group, I think, with some people from the Rabi Gavi synagogue, is to work to resettle one refugee family. So on Thursday, the family that we've been working on with people from Temple Sinai and about 6 or 7 other churches and a couple of mosques, it was just like this amazing interfaith effort. We're going to come together and have a potluck at our church on Thursday. So it's next Thursday, not this week, but a week from Thursday. And the family will be there, and they are just like so lovely. They're Muslim, so don't bring pork and so on. But it's just been such a life-changing thing for my husband and I to lead this, to really get to know these people, so that it's just a much different way of doing volunteering than just writing a check or reading a book or doing another study. So I would just, open that up and, talk to us before you leave, because we want to keep track of the number of people that are coming. But everybody would be welcome. Oh, 6 o'clock. Yeah, it's like what's the address? 799 Hot Meadow, I think. Simsbury United Methodist. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so we're actually past time. So if anybody has a last comment they want to throw out there, they're welcome to. Otherwise, we will just.
In response to your what should we do, on an individual basis, you can't be silent. If you hear, you don't need to beat somebody up, but if you hear something inappropriate,
That's not cool. Yeah.
You can accept that whoever said it is ignorant. Doesn't mean that they are evil.
100%. No, I think that we often have this sense of, oh, that was really awful, but if I say something, then I'm going to create awkwardness in this moment, or maybe I'll offend. And those are all things that we deal with, but at the end of the day, we only have our actions that we can count on. And taking a stand in my experience, as somebody who usually has not done social action work on behalf of Jewish people, my social action work has been for other groups generally. But the actual taking a stand is a fortifying thing. You come away feeling like you actually are part of the solution instead of just watching a problem. And so I absolutely encourage folks to take stands on a micro level when you've got a pal who's throwing around tropes that they may not realize are problematic, to acknowledge that, to say, hey, this could be seen as something that's really problematic. And taking a stand on bigger things as well. Usually in the bigger moments, we need to do so as a collective. And I find it to be very fortifying work to do. Anyway, thank you all so much. I'm so glad to have been able to share some time with you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.